Like, good luck robbing a bank in Texas. Okay, like everyone carries in Texas, so you try to rob a bank in Texas, you're probably going to get shot. It's not going to work. So it can really this system can work, but there's some drawbacks to it. There's some dangers of this individualism, this rugged individualism, where the protection starts with the individual and then radiates outward. Let's move into this other thing here, this stuff about guns, because this is a big one right now, right? Everyone's going crazy about the gun stuff since this most recent shooting. And I want to look at it from a different perspective. I want to look at this gun control thing from a different perspective, because I think everyone's going right into their political party talking points, and they're not really looking at any of the psychological stuff too much, at least in terms of where your opinion comes from. And I think here's my take on it. I'm no evolutionary psychologist, but I know a thing or two. So I think the real issue here, why we're having such a divide over this stuff, it comes down to a more primal level. It's not even on the rational level. I think it's more about this primal level where we're talking from our primate brains, all right? And I think there's two different camps that people fall into. And which camp you fall into determines automatically, before you even rationally form an opinion, which side of the debate you're on. And then I think people have a tendency to build their arguments based upon that unconscious assumption, or that unconscious choice or predisposition, I would say, unless they've really looked at themselves. They have this unconscious predisposition, and then they build their rationalizations to support that predisposition. Okay, so here are the two sides of it that I see. All right, on one side, the people who are more pro-gun, I would say that they view themselves as protectors. Okay, and what do I mean by that? Well, I would say that there's someone who, if they were armed, if they had a gun and they saw someone starting to engage in violence, start a shooting or an act of terrorism, they would want to stop that person. Instead of running away, they would want to run toward. They would want to draw their gun and put that person down. Okay, and I don't think that this is the immediate reaction of everybody. I think that there is a segment of the population who that is their immediate reaction. They have the fight response. And this, I would say, is more common in men. And I don't think that's super controversial. Guys are more aggressive and more combative in that sort of sense. And so they're willing to take that stance. Another piece of it all is responsibility. It's like they want to be responsible for their protection. They want to be the one, like they don't want to have to rely on someone else to protect them. They want to be like, okay, I want to be armed so that I can stop anything that bad from happening to me, from happening to my family, and happening to my loved ones. And not only do they want to be armed so that they can be responsible for it, they also want their brother, their baker, and their barber to be armed as well. They want anyone who is a good, God-fearing citizen to be armed so that as a community, they can police themselves. And this is kind of like this idea of an individualism, okay? It's the idea that this protection, this responsibility for protection, it starts with the individual and then radiates out. And you can see this, that guns have stopped, on private citizens, have stopped many, many crimes, okay? You can look it up. Like, good luck robbing a bank in Texas, okay? Like, everyone carries in Texas. So you try to rob a bank in Texas, you're probably going to get shot. It's not going to work. So it can really, this system can work, but there's some drawbacks to it. There's some dangers of this individualism, this rugged individualism, where the protection starts with the individual and then radiates outward. Okay, the biggest issues with this approach is, you have incompetence. So you got that idiot who's really into guns and he's not really responsible or that kind of thing. And he, shoots someone who shouldn't be shot, or he shoots himself in the foot, or that kind of thing. So that's one big issue, right? Or the person who leaves their gun out and a kid gets a hold of it and does something terrible. That's a real issue, okay? But then there's also the issue of abuse, like someone who takes that, the access to buy guns and does something terrible with it, like, this shooter or some kind of criminal or something like that. Like that's horrible. That's absolutely horrible, and it's a direct result of us empowering citizens in this way. So the requirement then, though, for this system to work as a whole is that you need to have individuals, like a culture where individual responsibility and pursuit of personal excellence and morality even is a priority. You need to have these things. You need to have this philosophy that allows the individual to thrive and become responsible and capable enough to handle that kind of responsibility of having a gun and protecting themselves and policing their neighborhood and that sort of thing. So, and this is the side that I fall on. I believe that that's a better system, okay? Because now it's time to look at the other side, which has its points, I would say, but it's got some issues. So the other side of the debate, the anti-gun side, I would say the primal disposition of them is to view themselves as someone who needs protection. Okay, like instead of being that person who's willing to go into the fight, they're the one who runs. So this is what happened with the police officer at the Parkland shooting. Was he he didn't go in. And I'm laughing because it's so terrible. It's like, dude, it was your job to protect these kids, and you did not. You just didn't do your job. And so, like, that's the kind of person that makes a person like me be like, all right, I want responsibility because I can't trust you. You're a police officer and you fucking shit the bed. That's terrible. That's terrible. It's unacceptable. And so, like, but there are people out there that are like this. It's just their configuration. This is like, if you're that kind of person who naturally would not want to confront this kind of stuff, then of course you would want someone else to have that responsibility, right? And it always cracks me up when you have people who are talking, anti-gun, and they live in a gated community, or they have like armed bodyguards and that kind of thing. Well, yeah, of course you're cool with like, someone else having the guns and not the average person, because you have someone else who's got you covered, right? But I mean, there are people who don't have that, and they're still very, very anti-gun. And maybe they're just better people than me. Maybe they just have a higher opinion of humanity. They're willing to die. They're willing to they're willing to trust that they're going to be okay. And I see that as naive. It's just not my style. I would rather have that power. And I would argue that it's even potentially like a more feminine kind of disposition. Because if you think about it, women, they evolved to somehow handle their intense periods of vulnerability when they're pregnant, right? And who did they rely on? They relied on someone else, usually the man or the community, to protect them in that vulnerable state. And so you have, I think, women leaning toward the anti-gun side naturally, and then also more feminized men who have adopted a more feminine disposition leaning on that side. But, I get the argument. Like, it's not completely, I would say, crazy. I mean, like, if we can make sure our police were super competent and our government was phenomenal, and we can make sure no bad guys get a hold of guns, then we're all good, right? We're totally fine. But can you really do that? I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think you can really do that. But what would be the risks of trying? Well, this is where you get into like the deeper philosophy of like, if the pro-gun side is more individualist in its perspective, then the anti-gun side, I would say, is significantly more collectivist. They're in the idea that like the government should have the power. The government should be the ones who do it. It's the group that needs to have the power, not the individual. And, I get it. It's like you want the government to have more responsibility so that you can have less. But the problem with this is that, okay, this is where it gets into the really deep stuff that most people don't get to when it comes to this debate, or if they do, they kind of gloss over it. Is the purpose of why we have guns in the first place, right? The United States is founded upon this system of checks and balances, where you got your executive, legislative, and judicial branch, and they're all balanced against each other, so one side can't have too much power. But the whole, like, who's the balance against the government if the government goes sour, if they get corrupt? Well, it's supposed to be the armed populace. That's why we have guns. We don't have guns so much so that, like, because our founding fathers thought they were cool. We have guns because our founding fathers thought that we had to hold our government accountable. Basically, like, if the government became corrupt, it was our job to overthrow them. And so people who are anti-gun, they would say, oh, this would never happen. This would absolutely never happen. Our government is so good and, cares about us so much that it would never spiral into something, some kind of tyrannical dictatorship. And I just don't think anyone who thinks that has read enough history. Maybe I'm skeptical by nature, but I don't trust the government to be wonderful for forever. I think it's very possible for very corrupt things to happen and for very bad things to happen. And, I think a well-armed populace is at least a deterrent to a lot of that bad stuff happening in a very overt sort of sense. And then you have to play that final game where, you know, the someone who was attacking me, one of the main things they would say is like, so do you think it's worth it to have these guns? And now there's, you know, X number of kids killed. And it's like, okay, well, what are we stacking up here? If things go bad in either plan, what are the worst case scenarios? So in the individualist scenario where you empower the citizen to have access to guns, worst case scenario is you get these psychopaths who do terrible, terrible freaking things. And it's really bad. It's not good. It's a very sad thing. And a psychopath like this, they could get a kill count, you know, in the tens, the dozens, maybe even the hundreds if they're like, you know, they go uncaught for a long period of time, right? But what happens if you get a government that goes bad? What happens if you get a government that goes bad? If you get a tyrannical government? Well, I mean, we saw what happened, you know, less than 100 years ago. We saw hundreds of millions, like tens of millions at least, people killed by communism, you know, by communism and fascism. These things exist, and they killed so many people, astronomical numbers of people. And so what you're really holding up then is the risk of individuals going rogue and abusing power versus governments going rogue and abusing power. That's the way that I see it. And so to me, it's kind of one of those things that comes with the risk, and it's not a good thing. And none of this means that there shouldn't be some sort of regulation around guns. I don't want to make I don't want to make it sound like, you know, we should have access to every single kind of gun everywhere. I don't think a 21-year-old should be able to go in and buy an RPG or some kind of crazy stuff, or like buy like a full like machine gun or something like that. But when you start getting into the specifics, that's an entirely different story about what kind of regulations are in place. And I think that that's a good conversation that needs to occur. Absolutely. But I think that people are stuck on these primal biases so much that they're not even able to hear each other anymore. There's just, you know, fury and emotional outrage and that kind of stuff. And, you know, primarily people talking about guns who have no idea what guns are. They don't know how they work. They don't understand the terminology, and they don't, you know, like, I can't even tell you the number of times like people like misunderstand what an assault weapon is. They don't know what an assault rifle is, like what the difference between that and, you know, a semi-automatic versus a fully automatic. And okay, well, if you outlaw this, well then, you know, you might have to outlaw a million different things. So there's a lot of nuance there that if you're curious about, I encourage you to look up. You know, look up arguments for gun rights or something like that. I mean, there's so much information out here about the specifics, but I just wanted to give you guys my take on this. I think that as a man, you want to take on more responsibility where you can take it on. You want to learn how to manage yourself, manage your affairs as best as possible. And I believe that requires access to guns, at least in this country, because of the culture and the situation that has arose around it. And I'm gonna pick individualism over collectivism all the time. So that's my take on that.